Here I am again, in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. Continuing with the historical evidence for preservation, I will now discuss the actual evidence. What is the actual evidence that needs to be evaluated? The continuous text manuscripts are the primary witness. The lectionaries are secondary witnesses. The ancient versions and patristic citations are tertiary witnesses. Any historical evidence, to the extent that it can be verified, is ancillary. Attention, please. The relevance of the secondary and tertiary types of evidence depends upon the presuppositions that the original wording was lost and that the transmission of the text was not normal. Since both of those presuppositions are false, I will confine my attention to the primary witnesses, the more so since there are so many of them. The primary witnesses are customarily treated as being of three types: the papyri, the uncials, and the cursives. The papyri and the uncials are both written with uppercase letters, often without spacing between words. The difference being in the material used, papyrus or parchment, that's leather. The cursives are written with lowercase letters, often run together, and usually with spacing between words. The material used was parchment or paper. The uncial script was exclusively used until the 9th century, when the first cursive manuscripts appeared. By the 11th century, the cursive script had taken over. The International List of Extant or Known New Testament Manuscripts, it's in Greek, is maintained by the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany. It is called the Kurzgefasste Liste. As of February 2018, that list contained 133 papyri, 282 uncials, that's majuscules, and about 2,850 numbered cursives or minuscules. The dating of manuscripts is a slippery business, vulnerable to presupposition, bias, and party line. The reader should understand that the dates that have been assigned to the individual manuscripts may be little more than rough guesses, so much so that they are usually given as a century. When a manuscript has a specific date, the copyist wrote the date when he finished his work. I made a rough tabulation of the papyri by century, taking the later date when there was an option. This paragraph and the next are simply based on the lista, whether I agree or not. Going on, they range from the 2nd to the 8th centuries. The 2nd has 4, the 3rd has 49, the 4th has 31, the 5th has 14, the 6th has 16, the 7th has 16, and the 8th has 3. Of these, or of those 133 papyri, 35 have less than 5 verses. They are mere fragments. In passing, I offer my own opinion that the only contribution of a fragment is to establish that any variant it contains existed when it was written, if it was not created by the copyist. A fragment earlier than 100 AD establishes that the book existed at that time. Going on, 76 papyri have between 6 and 20 verses, still fragments. 13 have less than 2 chapters. Only 9 of them are of significant size. For some 40 chapters throughout the New Testament, there is no papyrus witness. Only Luke, John, Acts, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude have a papyrus witness for 1 full chapter. Only 1 papyrus has a complete book. Papyrus 72 contains 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude. The importance attached to the papyri will depend on one's presuppositions. I made a rough tabulation of the uncials by century, taking the later date when there was an option. They range from the 3rd to the 11th centuries. The 3rd century has 2, the 4th has 18, the 5th has 50, the 6th has 65, the 7th has 36, the 8th has 27, the 9th has 62, the 10th has 20, and the 11th has 2. Of these 282 uncials, 182 have less than 1 chapter. Most of them have only a few verses, some even less. Another 37 have less than a whole book. Only 63 have a complete book or more. The importance attached to the uncials will depend on one's presuppositions. The cursives range in date from the 9th to the 17th centuries. The heavy majority of them, some 2,130 of them, are bunched in 4 centuries, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th. Around 90 of them are rather fragmentary, and many more are not complete. Around 25 of them have a number, but so little is known about them that they evidently are not available. And as many more have disappeared from sight. Even so, there are enough left to keep us busy for a long, long time. Until the invention of paper, the materials used for making copies were papyrus or parchment, both of which are thicker than paper. A complete New Testament bound in 1 volume would be rather bulky and quite expensive. So early on, the books started to be bound in smaller groups. The 4 Gospels, the letters of Paul, including Hebrews, Acts, and the general epistles, and Revelation added on here and there. The Gospels were by far the most popular, followed by Paul's letters. At this writing, we know of around 2,350 manuscripts, including fragments, that contain some part of the Gospels, around 800 that contain some part of Paul's letters, over 650 that contain some part of Acts, over 600 that contain some part of the generals, and about 300 that contain some part of Revelation. We know of around 60 complete New Testaments, another 150 that contain all the books except Revelation, and around 270 that contain from Acts through Jude, that is, they do not have the Gospels or Revelation. Not all of the above will be available for an interested person to work with. Consider the Gospels. Of the 2,350 manuscripts mentioned above, for any single Gospel like John, the number will be around 2,000. But because of fragments, damage, and lacuna, for any given verse, the number will be around 1,700. The INTF in Münster, Germany holds microfilms of almost all of them. However, such an interested person needs to understand that he is not dealing with 1,700 independent witnesses. Those manuscripts represent a variety of lines of transmission, or families. Such families would be the witnesses. For example, Frederick Wisse collated and compared 1,386 manuscripts in Luke 1, 10, and 20. That's 3 complete chapters. He reduced those manuscripts to 37 groups or families, plus 89 mavericks, that is 89 manuscripts that were all by themselves. It happens that 36 of the 37 fall within the broad Byzantine river of transmission. He found 70 subgroups within the 36. So he felt able to define those relationships based on the profiles. But there will be interrelationship between families, and to be sure about such relationships, we need a scientifically elaborated reconstruction of the history of the transmission of the New Testament text. Lamentably, no such reconstruction exists. Worse, due to the soporific effect of the Hortian theory, the families have yet to be defined. I have scientifically defined family 35 for the whole New Testament. But so far as I know, no other family has been similarly defined. It may be that no other family exists throughout the entire New Testament, but that has yet to be determined. Those who catalog New Testament manuscripts inform us that the 12th and 13th centuries lead the pack in terms of extant manuscripts, followed by the 14th, 11th, 15th, 16th, and 10th in that order. There are over 4 times as many manuscripts from the 13th century as from the 10th. But obviously, Koine Greek would have been more of a living language in the 10th than in the 13th. And so there would have been more demand and therefore more supply. In other words, many hundreds of really pure manuscripts from the 10th century perished. A higher percentage of the really good manuscripts produced in the 14th century survived than those produced in the 11th and so on. That is why there is a progressive level of agreement among the Byzantine manuscripts, there being a higher percentage of agreement in the 14th century than in the 10th. But had we lived in the 10th and done a wide survey of the manuscripts, we would have found very nearly the same level of agreement, perhaps 98%. The same obtains if we had lived in the 8th century, the 6th, the 4th, or the 2nd century. In other words, the surviving manuscripts from the first 10 centuries are not representative of the true state of affairs at that time. Kurt Aland seems to grant that down through the centuries of church history, the Byzantine text was regarded as the text of the church, and he traces the beginning of this state of affairs to Lucian. He makes repeated mention of a school of or at Antioch and of Asia Minor. All of this is very interesting because in his book he agrees with Adolf Harnack that, quote, about 180 the greatest concentration of churches was in Asia Minor and along the Aegean coast of Greece, end quote. This is the area where Greek was the mother tongue and where Greek continued to be used. It is also the area that started out with most of the autographs. But Aland continues. Even around AD 325, the scene was still largely unchanged. Asia Minor continued to be the heartland of the church, end quote. The heartland of the church. So who else would be in a better position to identify the correct text of the New Testament? Who could sell a fabricated text in Asia Minor in the early 4th century? I submit that the Byzantine text dominated the transmissional history because the churches in Asia Minor vouched for it, and they did so from the very beginning because they knew it was the true text, having received it from the apostles. The majority text is what it is just because it has always been the text of the church. Now some concluding remarks. Up to this point, I have dealt with the broad river of the normal transmission of the New Testament text. This broad river is commonly referred to as the Byzantine text or text type, or the majority if you prefer. But this broad river is made up of many distinct lines of transmission within it. Recall that F. Wisse posited 36 such lines based on his study of Luke chapters 1, 10, and 20. Among those 36 lines, one is by far the largest in terms of the number of representative manuscripts, and I will argue that it is also clearly the best. I call that line of transmission Family 35, and my discussion of that family occupies part 2 of my book, God Has Preserved His Text. There, I will argue that Family 35 constitutes the ultimate proof that God has preserved the New Testament text. Given my presuppositions, I consider that I have good reason for declaring the divine preservation of the precise original wording of the complete New Testament text to this day. That wording is reproduced in my edition of the Greek New Testament, the Greek New Testament according to Family 35. The book may be ordered from Amazon.com, and it may be downloaded free from my site, www.punch.org, or from www.walkinhiscommandments.com. I here list my conclusions, promising the reader that I will then give the evidence that leads to those conclusions. That's in part 2, besides those that have already been given. On the basis of the evidence so far available, I affirm the following. 1. The original wording was never lost, and its transmission down through the years was basically normal, being recognized as inspired material from the beginning. 2. That normal process resulted in lines of transmission. 3. To delineate such lines, manuscripts must be grouped empirically on the basis of a shared mosaic of readings. 4. Such groups or families must be evaluated for independence and credibility. 5. The largest clearly defined group is family 35. 6. Family 35 is demonstrably independent of all other lines of transmission throughout the New Testament. 7. Family 35 is demonstrably ancient, dating to the 3rd century at least. 8. Family 35 representatives come from all over the Mediterranean area. The geographical distribution is all but total. 9. Family 35 is not a recension, was not created at some point subsequent to the autographs. 10. Family 35 is an objectively, empirically defined entity throughout the New Testament. It has a demonstrable diagnostic profile from Matthew 1:1 to Revelation 22, verse 21. That profile is given in part 2. The archetypal form of Family 35 is demonstrable. It has been demonstrated. The original text is the ultimate archetype. This is 12 now. 12. The original text is the ultimate archetype. Any candidate must also be an archetype. A real, honest-to-goodness, objectively verifiable archetype. There is only one that has been identified so far. Family 35. 13. God's concern for the preservation of the biblical text is evident. I take it that passages such as 1 Chronicles 16, verse 15, Psalm 119, verse 89, Isaiah 40, verse 8, Matthew 5, verse 18, Luke 16, verse 17, and Luke 21, verse 33, John 10, verse 35, and John 16, verses 12 and 13, 1 Peter 1, verses 23 through 25, and Luke 4, verse 4 may reasonably be taken to imply a promise that the Scriptures, to the tittle, will be preserved for man's use, because we have to live by every word of God, and to the end of the world for 1,000 generations. But no intimation is given as to just how God proposed to do it. We must deduce the answer from what he has indeed done. We discover that he did. 14. This concern is reflected in Family 35. It is characterized by incredibly careful transmission, in contrast to other lines. I hold a perfect copy of the Family 35 archetypal text for most New Testament books. 22 of them. I hold it right here in my hand. I have copies made from a perfect exemplar, presumed, for another 4. As I continue to collate manuscripts, I hope to add the last one, Acts. But even for Acts, the archetypal form is demonstrable. 15. If God was preserving the original wording in some line of transmission other than Family 35, would that line be any less careful? I think not. So any line of transmission characterized by internal confusion is disqualified. This includes all the other lines of transmission that I have seen so far. 16. I affirm that God used Family 35 to preserve the precise original wording of the New Testament text. It is reproduced in my edition of the Greek text. Also, God used mainly the Eastern Orthodox churches to preserve the New Testament text down through the centuries. They have always used a text that was an adequate representation of the original for all practical purposes. So, I claim to have demonstrated the superiority of Family 35 based on size, number of representatives. Independence, it is demonstrably independent of all other lines of transmission. Age, it dates to the 3rd century at least. Geographical distribution, all over the Mediterranean area. Profile, empirically determined. Care by the copyists, and range, all 27 books. I challenge any and all to do the same for any other line of transmission. The original text is the ultimate archetype. Any candidate must also be an archetype, a real, honest, to goodness, objectively verifiable archetype. There is only one that has been identified so far. Family 35. And that's it.